absolutely adored Selena. They made it. She passed away 26 years ago. They made a movie about her life in 1997, starring Jennifer Lopez. And Jennifer Lopez and her famous hiney sat right there on that bridge for a very famous scene in the movie. And so for years, people would visit San Antonio. For years, people would visit San Antonio, and they would ask to take a picture on that spot. And they would say, which is the Selena Bridge. And over time, we started calling that the Selena Bridge, and now that's what everybody calls it, even though Selena never really did anything there. Although she did perform on the Riverwalk. You know where we saw that wedding? That's called the Artisan River Theater. She performed there. And that little island we went around where I was doing like rules, she performed there too. So she did perform on the Riverwalk, just not necessarily on that bridge. A few of them have, yeah. I mean, trees die just like any other tree. There's one right where the Hemisfair Tavern is on the other side of the river. There's an old cypress tree that they turned into a park. It was torn down, I think, like 20 or 30 years ago, and they turned it into a bench. So, but it would be the city love. I mean, the river people love this tree. So anytime the tree is sick or dying, it's pretty upset. These trees actually live for thousands of years. They're native to the eastern United States. They grow here in Texas all the way over to the Atlantic coast, and the oldest ones are over in North Carolina. Actually, there are several in a park in North Carolina that are about 3,000 years old. But they're not that much bigger than ours, because again, they just grow so slowly. How many people have been to the Alamo? Raise your hand. Half the boat. If we were at this exact spot 180 years ago, you would see the outer walls of the Alamo about 300 feet up in front of us right now. Now there's a hotel in the way, but you would see the Alamo right over here. So, that being said, if you want to get to the Alamo today, go through this hotel. It's the Hyatt Regency. Just go through the doors, out to the side, up the stairs. What exists today as the Alamo is really just an inner portion. It's just the chapel. The outer walls are completely gone. They were destroyed at the Battle of the Alamo, and they were also destroyed actually during the Civil War. There was some fighting. Most of the Civil War was over there in the southern states. There was a little bit of fighting here in Texas and here in San Antonio, and they did destroy the rest of the Alamo. Does anybody know the name Alex Haley, the author? He wrote a book called Roots, and he wrote it. It was a very important book, especially for the civil rights movement. It was back in the 70s, and he wrote it while he was living in these apartments right here. And it's called the Casino Club building. It's not a casino at all, but that's what they call it. Alex Haley, he wrote several books. He wrote like the autobiography of Malcolm X. He's a very important author. Ruth is actually a semi-historical novel about a man named Kunta Kinte who was from West Africa and was captured and made into a slave here in the U.S. And it's a family member of his, and he wrote about his life, and it kind of dramatized a little bit. But it was a very important book because it helped people understand the historical impact of slavery, especially during that time period when it was during the civil rights movement. It was a very important TV series in 1977, starring LeVar Burton. Has anybody eaten at these restaurants? Yeah. Where'd you guys eat? At Dick's? This restaurant over here, the Republic of Texas, is actually built out of the old office of the original architect of the Riverwalk. And you can see his name on the other side of these blue umbrellas. It says Architect R.H.H. Hutman right there. Robert Hutman is the father of the Riverwalk. He would spend most of his life trying to get the Riverwalk going. There's his face right there. That's what he looks like. That's that little statue right there. That's what he would look like if he were metal. He spent years getting the Riverwalk. So he had the idea in 29, took 10 years to get funding, 2 years to build it, and then they built the Riverwalk. They completed it in 1941, and for 5 years, that was the only thing there. That was the only thing on Riverwalk, just that office. Because nobody was sure that, nobody knew at the time if the flood channel worked. It wasn't until 1945 when there was a flood in San Antonio, and everybody saw that the flood channel worked, so that meant that the Riverwalk was safe. And the very next year, in 1946, the first restaurant opened on the Riverwalk. That restaurant is this one right here. It's the Casa Rio. This is where the Riverwalk was born. What you're looking at right here, this is like iconic. This is iconic San Antonio. If you're part of the Tourism Bureau back in the 50s, this image is what you're sending to the world to get people to come to our city. Beautiful people eating Mexican food under colored umbrellas with ducks going by. There's mariachi bands in the back. Back in the 50s, this is also where you could rent paddle boats. You would rent paddle boats over here, you could rent canoes, and you just kind of did your own thing on the river. Now, the Riverwalk was always meant to be a tourist attraction, but it wasn't really attracting that many tourists for the first 20 years. A lot of people thought it was a failure. That would change in the 1960s, though. San Antonio was invited to host a World Fair, which was a really big deal. A World Fair was like the Olympics. A World Fair meant that millions of people would be coming to San Antonio, if you pull off a good World Fair, your city does become a tourist attraction, and that's exactly what San Antonio wanted. So most of the 60s was spent rebuilding everything. They rebuilt the entire downtown. Theaters, museums, libraries, where the bridges were the roads. They built a lake down here. The lake is completely gone, and they built this part of the river. So this entire stretch of river right here is man-made. That's why the walls are vertical. Do you notice how the walls are vertical? That's because they just dug it out of the ground. They just cut it straight from the limestone, and they put a river down the middle of it. There was a sky right over the top. There was a monorail system nearby. There was actually a sporting arena over here called the Hemisfair Arena. That got torn down once they built the Alamo Dome. But the Hemisfair Arena, fun fact, is where the San Antonio Spurs originally played when they first came to town.
Yeah, go Spurs!
Yeah, there you go. Hey, raise your hand if you know the name George Gervin.
Yeah.
The Iceman, that's right. So if you know anything about Spurs culture down here, so there's in the Spurs world, there's the Tim Duncan era, there's the David Robinson era. Before that is the Iceman era. George Gervin. He had his own layup that nobody else could do. It was called the finger roll. Everyone tried to emulate it. But and George Gervin's still around. He's still part of the community. See him on TV all the time. He does a lot of charity work. But for our World Fair in '68, we actually copied a lot of ideas from Seattle. Seattle had a World Fair in '62, and it was very successful. So we copied a lot of their concepts. And probably the most famous example of that was the Space Needle, which is a building in Seattle, which is a circular building on a tower. And there's a restaurant and an observation deck. And so 6 years later, San Antonio built the Tower of the Americas. There it is on the right-hand side, 750 feet tall. There's a restaurant up there. But for me, the coolest thing about the tower is actually the shaft, because that, if you didn't know, that's actually a giant churro. That's what they used. The world's largest churro. They just fried it up. They stuck it in the ground. And then they got some cajeta. They got cajeta and they glued the building on the top. That's how they built that.
Now that he said it, yeah.
You guys know what cajeta is? Cajeta is like Mexican taco. If you get churros, go get some, anywhere you get churros, you're going to get a cup of cajeta. It's making goat's milk. It's like really rich caramel. Super good.
I have never ever had anybody drink caramel with a churro.
Oh.
You're from DC? You're from Oklahoma. Congratulations, happy anniversary. And a birthday. Everything you see around you right now, this is the convention center. In 1968, our convention center was just this theater over here to the left. When you look over here to the left, you're going to see a mural. That is a mural. The name of the mural was the theme of the World Fair. It is Confluence of Civilizations. There is 40,000 stones in this mural. Every single stone hand-selected and cut by the artist Juan O'Gorman from Mexico. Every single stone is actually from Mexico. They're from geological sites in Mexico. So there's lots of symbolism there. There's lots of cultures. San Antonio is a mix of a lot of different cultures and histories, and so there's just tons of symbolism there in that building representing all those histories. And now, this is the part of the tour. Boy, I remember that because this came closed for years, and they just opened it up. Or anything to point out over here. Usually, lately there's been my favorite bird over here, but I think they're all migrating now. We have these really cool herons in San Antonio, and they've been here. They like staying over here, and I've been able to point them out and talk about my favorite birds, but I don't see any right now. So. Point out these really pretty blue lights. They change colors every single time I come over here. It's all the convention center. It's a huge convention center. I can sing a song. You know Nacho Libre? Yeah. Nacho Libre is one of the greatest works of cinematic masterpiece. It really is. It's about a Mexican wrestler who falls in love with a nun, and at the final scene of the movie, right before the fight, he sings this love song for her, and it goes like this. When the fantasies have ended and all the children are gone, something good inside me helps me to carry on. I ate some bugs, I ate some grass, I used my hands to wipe my tears, to kiss your mouth, I break my vows. No, 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 wait for say, unless you want to, and then we break our vows together. Encarnación.